Welcome to Trial Site News podcast series. The University of Wisconsin-Madison represents one of the top research centers in the world. Set in an idyllic Midwestern town filled with beautiful lakes and bustling university life, some call University of Wisconsin the Berkeley of the Midwest. Trial Site News covered a story about some administrative and cultural challenges uncovered during the review by Mary Westrick of University of Wisconsin's clinical research program. Now, Ms. Westrick, who Trial Site News principal Daniel O'Connor collaborated with on an emerging clinical research site accreditation standard, reported that major cultural change needed to occur, spearheaded by their top leadership. Enter Elizabeth Betsy Nugent, Master of Science in Public Health and Certified Clinical Research Professional. In September, Ms. Nugent became Director of Clinical Trials Development and Accreditation / Chief Clinical Research Officer. She has been brought in to guide the organization to regain its preeminent research status. So, Betsy, welcome. We are honored to have you with us, taking the time to talk to us and our audience. So, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you. Now, you spent nearly 3 decades running clinical trials programs. Specifically, you spent the last 13 years as the Senior Regional Manager of Clinical Trials at Kaiser. Can you share with the audience, high level, what you did there, how you organized clinical research teams, and could you share why you think you had such great results?
Sure. So I might start with what Kaiser Permanente is, because not everyone's familiar with that. And it's really one of the largest integrated health systems in the country. And it does have a national presence, although it's mainly concentrated in the Western U.S. So California, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, those areas have the biggest coverage. And they cover about 12 million individuals nationwide. So it's a huge integrated health system. My role at Kaiser Permanente really centered around 2 primary areas. One area was ensuring that we had efficient quality operations in place for the conduct of clinical trials for the Colorado region. And the Colorado region included 31 facilities across the state. And my other role was to work with the national clinical trials team within Kaiser Permanente to develop common systems, procedures, and approaches to our clinical trials work. And in terms of the organization, the clinical research teams were organized centrally and by function, so much like industry does. And that helped us to grow individuals that had true mastery over their area of expertise, where they were specifically trained and maybe certified in research, and they could support all therapeutic areas. So rather than them having content knowledge in, say, oncology, they were specifically trained in their function. So if their function was regulatory affairs, they would be trained in all things regulatory affairs, and then would be actually deployed into a study team. So in that study team, they would help with the processing of essential documents. They would do the IRB submissions. They would work on communications with the sponsors, all of the regulatory aspects, and they would do that for that specific study. And I think much of our success probably stemmed from a shared belief that research should be optimized so that the burden of research is really on the research team and not on the patients. Right. And therefore, we really work to integrate research into our patient care work streams whenever that was a possibility. And so when you really think about the types of patients that choose to participate in a clinical trial, they're often quite ill. They may, have cancer or a neurologic disease, or they may have a high disease burden. And so asking them to do numerous additional visits or tasks can become a real disincentive to participating in a clinical trial. Right. And I think there's also strong evidence that participation in a clinical trial is often because of altruistic reasons. So they may not be doing it so much for themselves as to help improve the health of their family, their children, their grandchildren, the community, or even others that have the same disease now or may have it in the future. And some of them choose to participate just to advance medicine in general. And that gives us even more reason to be really respectful and considerate of their time and their resources. So in addition to this patient-centric model, we also had very, very talented coordinators, regulatory staff, and clinical trials implementation managers that really were constantly working with an eye to quality improvement. They were really, quite honestly, a group of lifelong learners who were constantly challenging themselves to do things better. And they really pushed me to develop my leadership skills in ways I never imagined I was going to need to do. And I truly believe that their desire to constantly move both the processes of clinical research as well as their own work culture in a positive way drove us to the great results we had at Kaiser Permanente.
Gotcha. Now speaking of, what would you consider to be your biggest accomplishment at Kaiser so far?
Wow. So there's so much about my time at Kaiser Permanente that I'm really proud of. So if I can share a couple of things, that would be really great.
Absolutely. Go for it.
Okay. I think one of the greatest accomplishments came when I first took over the clinical trials department. Mm-hmm. We really came together as a team and were able to work together to triple the number of studies we had open within a year.
Oh, wow.
And that number continued to increase year over year. And what's really special about that is we had to be so creative. Back at the time when this was going on, Kaiser Permanente was really not even on the map in terms of clinical trials. We would get passed over a lot for other academic institutions or for commercial clinical trial sites. And because we were primarily just a clinical provider, we often didn't get selected for clinical trials. And so we came up with an idea that we would talk to industry sponsors and say, if you have studies where you're having difficulty recruiting, can we try to recruit for you? And companies basically said sure, because what did they have to lose? They had low accrual on those studies and they weren't improving. And so we really took on those studies. And because we were early adopters of Epic, we really utilized our data science to help us identify those patients and really be successful at recruitment. Once that started to happen, the word started getting out in the contract research organizations and industry sponsors, and pretty soon they were knocking down our door asking us to open their studies. So I think that creativity and our ability to really think about how are we going to get into this marketplace and how are we going to break in as a great provider is one of the things that I'm most proud of.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that was forward thinking, and you were giving yourself a value-added piece to your endeavor there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that I'm really proud of is Kaiser Permanente, because there were no research standards available at the time, decided to come up with research standards nationally for their clinical trials programs. And so each of the regions, of which I think at that point in time there were 8, really needed to come up with a plan and a structure that would meet the obligations of these standards. And so the Colorado region was really the first region to pass an intensive audit of our operations and adherence to these quality standards. And that was entirely due to the culture of quality improvement and the solution-oriented nature that we built into our clinical trials teams. And so that's something that I was extremely proud of. And our team really became a mentor to other regions about how to really do this in a systematic and thoughtful way.
Now, do you see any similarities between Kaiser and the UW?
You know what, I do. I really believe that there are a lot of similarities between Kaiser Permanente and the University of Wisconsin. Both of these organizations are widely innovative, and they're constantly trying to move science and medicine forward. That is a clear mission that I heard at Kaiser Permanente, And that's a clear mission that I hear at University of Wisconsin. Both organizations are also just full of people who are so driven by the mission of providing the best care that they possibly can to patients that it's almost uncanny how similar they are. I think the focus on innovation is truly part of the focus in both these organizations, and it really makes me feel right at home here at University of Wisconsin.
That's awesome. And then that sounds like it just sets you up for moving to Kaiser with a similar culture there. Now, can you talk a little bit more about organizational culture and how research leaders can keep their research centers dynamic, vibrant, and on top of their field?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first, it's critical as a leader in the research field to continue to work on our own leadership skills. Not only is clinical research dynamic, but we are in a time when the workforce is also really dynamic, and rethinking and refining the skills that will continue to serve our research teams is going to be paramount right now and in the future. You know, clinical research is highly regulated, as it should be. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes teams can become so fearful in that highly regulated environment that they get scared of making a mistake, and they ultimately become paralyzed in terms of their innovation and quality improvement that needs to happen in the work that they're doing. So the regulations are there for a reason, but that reason really isn't to limit our ability to be efficient, effective, or to continue to improve the quality of our work. You know, by its very nature, clinical research is at the very cutting edge or the leading edge of medical care. And that means we need to develop processes and structures that are also at the cutting or leading edge in terms of the way we manage clinical research. You know, we're going to make mistakes along the way. I certainly have. And a culture that makes that part of our growth and our improvement is really going to be critical. You know, I've used a technique that's common in training medical residents where we review something that doesn't go well, whether it's a mistake on informed consent or we have an error on drug accountability or whatever the topic might be. And then as a team, we would work through how we might do it better next time. And so, you know, when you might have a culture where there's some fear around mistakes and making errors, it can be hard to get that started. And so what I've done a couple times to get it started is that I or a physician partner that I might have would use examples from our own research work where we had mistakes that were made, and we would ask the research teams what they would do to improve our outcomes. And we get a lot of engagement around these meetings, and our research processes improve as a result. And as a leader, you know, I've never believed that I have the only or even the best answer to any specific problem. I think in clinical research, every day is a new day, and things come up that you never, ever thought you would have to deal with. And right. I think having our research teams involved in developing those creative solutions can really create an engaged and effective workforce that is empowered to do the right thing. I also think, and part of this might be my education in biostats and epidemiology as part of public health, is that I really, really love data. I think data is very powerful. And I find that developing and reporting metrics that make sense for clinical research programs in a really transparent way can be crucial. I think anytime teams are faced with change, it's really important to have good visibility on how we're progressing to really help with the fatigue that can happen when there's a lot of ambiguity around processes, or we're trying to change our structures or our workflows. And I think it also gives us the opportunity to change direction really quickly when we see we aren't making the progress that we had planned. And I think having those metrics available and transparent widely is such an important part of the culture change that really is inherent in clinical trials.
Now you mentioned, obviously clinical trials is highly regulated, and you talked about the paralysis that can cause. What are some warning signs for a major research center that the culture is moving in the wrong direction?
I think there's probably some pretty clear signs and some more subtle ones that can indicate that an organization is heading into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
I think when research staff stop talking to leadership and retention rates for research personnel start to slip, I think that's a pretty good indicator that your organization is moving in the wrong direction. I think individuals that choose a career in clinical research feel so precious to me because it's a very challenging field and you need to have a lot of resilience, creativity, and drive to really be successful. And ultimately, the quality of the research is impacted by who you have doing your work. And so once that workforce starts to disengage, I think you're headed for trouble pretty much every time. Well, I do think it's probably the same in many industries. I think it can be particularly troublesome in clinical research because fully training clinical research staff takes a lot of time and resource. So when you have a person leave, it may be 6 months or a year until you have somebody fully trained that can really step in for them. So that can be a big problem. I also think that if you have a lot of investigators who do one study and then don't want to do any more, you really need to take a look at the complexity of your research systems and whether that complexity is serving the organization in ways that truly add value to research. I think sometimes we can, as an institution, over-regulate research. It already comes with a lot of regulations, but we can really create paralysis in our research organization by just adding layer upon layer of regulation. I also think that there's some more subtle things like studies that may have no study deviations reported at all can indicate that you have a culture that is focused probably not on quality, or that researchers and staff are fearful for some reason of reporting errors, even if those errors have nothing to do with their work. So, the ability to report study deviations or protocol deviations is there for a reason, and that's because they happen in the course of a study, even when we're well-intentioned and operating at the best of our ability. Things like somebody doesn't end up coming in for their blood draw on time because they were on vacation. I mean, that's certainly not our fault, but that's something that needs to be reported because it's a deviation from the protocol.
Right.
I think also studies where you're seeing numerous protocol violations right after a monitoring visit. So, when somebody's actually doing the checking, that can indicate that the research team is not really following the protocol adequately. And that should probably be concerning as well.
Right. Now, when you, as a research organization, when you see the higher turnover, when you see your disengaged workforce there, and you kind of touched on a little bit here, but if you would expand on your thoughts on intervention and how to anticipate and then turn around your organization before it's too late.
Sure. So I am a huge believer in asking the questions. I think sometimes as leaders, we can see this happening and we don't have a good understanding of why people are unhappy, why they feel dissatisfied, why they'd want to go work for industry or another organization doing the same work. And so I've always found that having those conversations at the level that it's happening, so if it's research coordinators or if it's research managers, is really important so that I can understand what the barriers might be in terms of engaging our workforce and keeping them with us. I mean, we spend a lot of time and money training them. They're very important to the success of our research. And so we really don't want them to walk out the door. That's not our end goal. And so I've been pretty successful in the past about just having those conversations and not having them once, but continually having opportunities, town halls, discussions, breakfast meetings where people are really brainstorming and talking about how to make their career and their experience better. And I'm a huge proponent of that. And we'll continue to do that probably as long as I'm a leader in clinical research because I think it's that important.
Now, on the same vein, politics. How can politics and what is known as CYA be transcended by a high-impact organization driven by excellence and results?
I think one of the things about leadership in research is that we're so lucky because it has a very clear mission, and that is to move science and medicine forward. And I think if we can keep that at the forefront at all times, the politics can become a lot less important. So I actually have a really great example of this that involved a large group of investigators who wanted to come together nationally to do something really important in research that would, have the possibility to really drive care forward. And for years, they tried to come together and submit a large grant application to NIH. And for years, they failed to do it because they always ended up bickering about who would be the principal investigator.
Oh, wow.
So this, just over and over and over again. And I'm sure this is not new to folks that have worked in clinical research for a while. But at one meeting, which was probably doomed to come to the same end, I challenged them by saying, is it important who's in charge of this? Or is it important that we do this work? And there was literally dead silence. And I thought they, probably if they had tomatoes, they would have thrown them at me. But when the discussion started again, it completely changed to the collaborative work that had to happen. And the idea of who was in charge really started to become somewhat less important. And I think bringing us back to the reason we're all here and why we're trying to do this work is really, really critical. We really need to constantly reevaluate and keep our eyes on what's important and what we're trying to ultimately achieve with our research. And I was really lucky at one of the positions I've held just recently, where I was doing some of these sessions where I speak with the staff, the research staff, and really trying to understand where they're coming from. And one of the research coordinators said to me, well, can you tell us about your career and what were some of the projects that you worked on? And I'd never really gone back and thought about that because I did start as a research assistant at the University of Colorado. So their experience is very similar to my experience. But as I started going back and thinking about all the projects I worked on, so some of them were secondhand smoking and its impact on children. So that's now something that we accept. I worked on AIDS and HIV trials, and AIDS and HIV are now something that really we don't think about nearly as much because we have good drugs available for those diseases. I worked on early breast cancer trials. And so when you really go back as a researcher and think about all the things you worked on where you had a little piece of it and the impact that's made in moving science forward, how can we get obsessed with politics and being in a place where we're just trying to be politically savvy and not realize that we're contributing to something much, much bigger than ourselves. And so That's really the perspective that I try and keep in mind. I try to give the investigators, and I try and make sure that the staff is also thinking about.
Right. So moving forward, what is then your vision and strategy for the next half decade? Or putting it another way, how do you want to leave your mark as a professional?
I'm so glad you asked this question because I think it's been something that's been on my mind since I originally accepted this position at University of Wisconsin. I think that University of Wisconsin is in a very special position because of the timing of the Alliance for Clinical Research Excellence and Safety Accreditation Standards, or the ACRES accreditation standards. University of Wisconsin is actually an early adopter of those standards. And I feel like we have a unique opportunity to reimagine clinical research here using these standards as our framework. And so we're bringing together some really, really talented individuals who have broad experience, some of which are here at University of Wisconsin, some of which we'll be recruiting. And we are trying to build a clinical trials program that really makes the right thing to do the easy thing to do. We have a tremendous focus on creating a comprehensive workforce development plan for all of our clinical research professionals here, and I'm really, really excited about that. I would love for us to create a streamlined and efficient system within University of Wisconsin that supports appropriate growth in both investigator-initiated research and in research with industry sponsors, and makes us really a preferred partner with our biotech colleagues in the Madison area and hopefully beyond. I would love it if we had a nationwide or even a worldwide reach for our clinical research program.
Gotcha. So speaking of, what organizations do you recommend for future research leaders to join, to learn, or to learn and network and grow as a professional?
Wow. So there's a lot of great organizations out there, but there are a few that I find that I personally return to again and again. One of those is SOCRA, which is the Society for Clinical Research Associates. And it has some great training on fundamentals of clinical research that I've utilized for years to train my staff. I'm also certified through their program of Certified Clinical Research Professional, or the CCRP designation. And I've really found this to be very important in my career. It really requires you to keep up on what's going on in clinical research and be thoughtful about your learning going forward throughout your career. The nice thing about SOCRA too is they also have local chapters. So I know sometimes in both academia and other settings, travel funds can be difficult to get a hold of. And so they do training locally, and I'm pretty sure they have a chapter in almost every state in the US. So another organization is ACRP, which is the Association of Clinical Research Professionals. And it's another really wonderful group that often has very provocative speakers at their conferences that challenge the status quo in research and offer new and innovative approaches to common research issues. They also have a really wonderful workforce innovation initiative. They have a set of those, and they are working on core competencies for research staff that will be really important as research becomes more and more demanding. And then I think another group that is a little bit different is MAGI, and I'm not really sure what that stands for, but they tend to have particularly relevant conferences, and they're really wonderful for networking. So some of the individuals I met while I was either attending or speaking at MAGI conferences have been great mentors to me and have challenged my thinking in many areas, particularly around the business and management of different aspects of clinical trials.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today, Betsy. We greatly appreciate you taking the time, and we wish you the best in your future endeavors.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
The pleasure is ours. Now, for those of you in the audience who want to learn more, we'll be providing links in the description below. You can also find TrialSide News on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and the links will be provided in the description below as well. So thank you again for joining us today, Betsy. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.